and welcome to Found in Translation, a weekly-ish exploration of one fellow's translation of the Christian scriptures, one chapter or so at a time. I'm Brandon Rhodes, and across the internet from me is the translator himself, Brandon Johnson. Hi, Brandon.
Hey, Brandon.
Good to see you this week.
Yeah, good to see you.
Yeah, we've got we do have a whole chapter this time. We took our time in chapter 3 of Galatians, and we're going to do that again in chapter 5, but today we're just going to get through all of chapter 4. I'm looking forward to it. We just got a little preachy beforehand and academic,
right.
Bringing out books off the shelf to verify that we're not full of shit.
Right.
That was satisfying before we even hit record. So hopefully we can replicate some of that energy and extrapolate on it here in a few minutes. So if you haven't had a chance to read Brandon's translation, please do take a moment to read it. There's a link in the show notes or the episode notes or the video, whatever video site you're on. Please read through it and don't miss out on the footnotes. The words we're going to be exploring are, let's see here. We're going to talk about in verse 3, fundamental assumptions. That's often elementary principles or elemental spirits in other translations. Also in verse 3, world systems instead of just world. Later on, we're going to talk about the sort of monogendering of the people of God, referring to all of God's people as sons. Brandon choosing to use the word heirs instead, and why that's a great path forward. Later on, we're going to talk about gratification. And then the whole back half of this chapter, the whole enslaved girl and free woman, argument that Paul makes. We're going to spend some time talking about that a bit more at a meta level. Not so much about individual word translation decisions, just to acknowledge what happens when a large stretch is particularly complicated for all of us, not just to understand, but to not detest or feel nauseous about. So we're going to conclude on that. So go ahead and hit pause and give it a read. We'll be here. Hey everybody, welcome back. So the first couple words we want to talk about are in verse 3, but I'm wondering, Brandon, if you wouldn't mind just reading verses 1 through 3. Those as a recap for those listening, the words that we're going to be exploring are fundamental assumptions and world systems at the end of verse 3.
All right, here we go. Nevertheless, I'm telling you, for as long as an heir is a minor, despite being lord of everything, nothing distinguishes them from someone who is enslaved. Rather, they are under caregivers and household managers until the time designated by their father. It is the same for us. When we were children, we were enslaved under the fundamental assumptions of the world systems.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, it feels clear that this makes most sense if we recap a little bit of like what the flow is leading up to it. I mean, right there in that first verse, like, for as long as an heir is a minor, it's like, what are you talking about? Oh, if you read it as a letter instead of as just a chapter, it makes more sense. What's the context?
Yeah, it's going back to the last chapter where it's talking about the people of God, Israel, being under a nanny, the Torah being that nanny to help guide until there was enough maturing to internalize wisdom and right decision making, and be able to do that without having to, like, I need this specific rule in the specific situation to know what to do.
Yeah. And until the coming of the Messiah.
Right.
Which I guess in this metaphor is puberty. I'm not sure.
Something
it's
like
awkward
that.
and feels like death. Yeah. So there's so many places my sense of humor just wanted to go. Yeah, I think that's helpful. Now I'm getting ahead of myself.
Uh-huh.
Let's talk about these words. So fundamental
Yeah, yeah.
assumptions. It's usually what elemental spirits or forces.
Yeah, there's a few different ways. The NET does basic forces, ESV does elementary principles, um, which in this case is actually ESV wins as far as my favorite of the traditional big ones, which is rare. And then NRSV does elemental spirits, which is my least favorite of the options. Uh,
Mhm.
but
Why are these
but yeah,
problems? Because it's not in the Greek. I know you always say that.
yeah, no, no, no. Like, um, the word so basic, fundamental, elementary, like any of those are good. They're all synonyms. Those all work pretty well. Um, elemental, if you're thinking about like elementary school, like basic,
Hmm.
fundamental, general stuff that everyone should be have access to, right? Um, we start thinking about weird things about elementals, though. We start getting to like Asian philosophy with like the four elements: fire, water, earth, and air. We need air. Anyway, and so it starts getting weird and we start thinking about things that just have nothing to do with what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
So that's why I prefer not elemental, but it's correct technically if you're remembering that it's a synonym with like basic or fundamental.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so the spirits part is the one that gets weird. It really has to do with not spirits. That's not the word here. You can see I just popped up my Greek here. I'm going to move it off screen so it's not distracting. But yeah, I'm trying to find out look at what the word is itself. But yeah, it's the word stoicheia, which just means like first things. So it's actually one word that these two words that are in English are coming from.
Hmm.
So first things, first principles. I'm looking in the little dictionary entries here. Um, it applies sometimes even to like the letters of the alphabet as like the elemental elements, basic elements of like speech.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
just like the building blocks of how things work,
Hmm.
is really what's in view here.
Hmm.
And it doesn't have any connection to like spirit beings. Uh, is not what's in view.
Yeah. At least not linguistically. Like there are the metaphor is the argument is you are enslaved to these things. There is a sort of anthropomorphizing to it, and that comes down a little bit later in like verse 8. Nevertheless, when you do not see God, you are enslaved to what are not meant to be God's, but now you know that God, like on it
Right.
goes. But that doesn't, metaphor language doesn't impute like personhood. It's not an argument of personhood to something.
Mm-hmm.
There is a proto-personal nature
Right.
to all of reality if we're sacramentalists, but that is not what is in
Right.
view here.
We make sense out of reality by thinking of it in terms of being kind of like a person, which is
Yeah,
where you get the term personification.
yeah,
Um, but that doesn't mean that that's like inherent in the object or system itself.
right. It, that dominant translation, it aligns with. It seems like they took a broader theme in Paul's imagination in other letters, where there are these principalities and powers, rulers and authorities in the heavenly realms that dominate us, that are behind the hostility that keeps us apart from one another. And scholars like Walter Wink and others have argued that these are not necessarily personal, sentient beings.
Mm-hmm.
These are,
With their
it's
own
Paul.
consciousness. Yeah.
Yeah, there could be some sort of proto, like somewhere on the spectrum of that. It's more getting at the ways in which isms and archies, like Uh,
Patriarchy,
yeah,
sexism.
or
Yeah.
yeah, or anities, uh, Christianity, uh,
Hmm.
can get in the way and in some way bring some sense of order to the world, but also
Hmm.
enslave us, and claim our allegiance and our heart and our trust and our sense of security.
Yeah.
And the sum of all of that, the whole of that is greater than the sum of the parts. And toward that, argues Wink, and I would agree, using celestial or angelic kind of language to describe that, like when you
Hmm.
see white supremacism taking over like a fever, people, and they just want to go out and lynch somebody, like the
Hmm.
scapegoat mechanism, whatever it is, it seems to be almost supernatural, like the devil is at work in these people, like willing violence.
Yeah.
And so, fine, that's a like, I get that. Whether or not there is a celestial being there, there is it. We need language that is beyond sociological to describe it.
Sure. Yeah. It doesn't matter to me so
Yeah,
much what the source of these fundamental assumptions are that you're ascribing. Like
yeah,
it just is the fundamental assumptions of the world systems here. And whether that's coming from a gestalt, like just the sum of is greater than its
yeah,
parts, with like
yeah.
human, more than one human is involved, therefore you've got a system in play and it's kind of taking on a mind of its own because of that. Um, or if you're thinking that there are conscious beings like that are the source of these things, that's however you want to understand it, whatever makes sense to you, whatever your like home tradition supplies for
Mm-hmm,
that kind of stuff. That's there's flexibility there. Um,
mm-hmm.
but what it's not saying is that those it's not saying that the sources are what's doing the enslaving. It's the assumptions that come from those sources
Yes,
are what are causing the enslavement.
yeah.
Um,
And what matters
and
is whatever the actual mechanism is, Christ is overcome,
right, right,
and that we are to
and
live into that victory.
absolutely, and you can't forget that the context of this is that Torah being the nanny that was kind of guarding, protecting, trying to get the people not to live by these fundamental assumptions in the first place. And it could only do so much.
Yeah.
Um, it was a good but temporary and finite
Mm-hmm.
solution.
Yeah. Yeah. And so this language of uh, fundamental assumptions of the world systems, not the world, not the elemental spirits of the world. It's not talking about the cosmos. It's not talking about materiality,
Right,
as
right.
if it's
It's
like
not the
they're aligned
physical,
with the bad side.
right. It's not the physical planet or the like plane of existence that we're on, like in this world. And when we die, we're going to another world
Mm-hmm,
of in
mm-hmm.
heaven. Like that's not what it's talking about. It's talking about just like the way the world works, the status quo, the systems that are in place, that domination and hierarchy are the
Yeah.
assumptions.
Yeah.
um, and in order to not be under someone else's boot, you have to be wearing the boot. um, those are the fundamental assumptions that it's overcoming.
And if you need a little bit of proof, like we were alluding to earlier, context, just scroll up a little. Look at the end of chapter 3 for, there's neither Jew nor Greek, enslaved nor free, male and female. These
Right.
these distinctions that become divisions, um, that really is what can be one of the sources, one of the footholds of the fundamental assumptions or spirits or whatever it is going on, is that, like, so the whatever's common sense to you about these sort of social distinctions, where what makes you feel secure and safe and make sense of the world. Men are men and women are women, and that's all there is to it. Or sex is for procreation, and any sex that isn't that is like, those are some fundamental assumptions of the world systems called patriarchy. Like,
Mm-hmm.
uh and Christ has overcome that. And those are not determinative of your belonging in God's love.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. We were talking about when you read this as like, don't be enslaved by other religious beliefs besides Christianity, it gets really weird. Like, really weird, really fast. There's no context for that, first of all.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's talking to Jewish Christians who are trying to make non-Jewish Christians become Jewish Christians.
Mm-hmm.
Not, it has nothing to do with people who are trying to be non-Christian at all. It's all the people that are being addressed are already all Christians.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So it's where and the primary people being addressed are the Jewish Christians, not so they never had any connection with like other elemental spirits. They
Mm-hmm.
were only ever Yahweh followers. So
Mm-hmm.
that argument just doesn't work in the context.
No, sir. Yeah, like trust the sustained Hebraic nature of what's going on here.
Mm-hmm.
and and with that language of fundamental assumptions of the world systems paired with 328, the junior Greek slave free male and female, you're all one within Christ Jesus. It's sort of Paul tipping his hand and saying, here's kind of the broader imagination I have for how I make sense of all of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
This is the bigger story of Christ overcoming hostilities, and like check every assumption, interrogate all things before the like reality of Christ. And if it's making you be dicks to each other, stop.
Mm-hmm.
Like, do not let this become an opportunity for hierarchy.
Right. Is the sum up the way to sum up all of Torah is love your neighbor as yourself. Anything that comes in competition with that, you've got it wrong.
Yep. Yep. All right. So the next thing, anything more we need to say on this?
I
I feel
mean, we
like we're
could
going to come
probably
back
keep
to it.
going. We could keep
Yeah,
going. Yeah.
sure. Um, so the next one is in verse 5. It's a word that's been, I think, already used before in Galatians, in your translation of Galatians, and we'll see in other passages, and that's the word heirs, where
Mm-hmm.
Heirs, where it's typically, I mean, and it is in the Greek, sons. Um,
Right. Yeah.
Explain your feminist agenda, Brandon.
Well, I mean, I'm happy to have my feminist agenda,
First of
but
all, womanists. Yeah.
I mean, both. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then, um, so yeah. So like, if you look at, well, I'll read it and then we can get into
Yeah.
the details here. So I'm going to overlap a little bit, start back at verse 3. So it is the same for us. When we were children, we were enslaved under the fundamental assumptions of the world systems. But when the appropriate time came, God sent out his son, given birth from a woman and born under Torah, so that those under Torah would be purchased from enslavement, and so that we would receive adoption as heirs. So because you are heirs, God sent his son's life breath into our hearts, that we're calling out, Abba, Father. So then no longer are you enslaved, but instead are an heir. You are an heir and recipient of the inheritance through God.
Mm, the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Yeah, so if you notice some of these, there's a lot of heir and a couple of sons, but when it's son, it's specifically
It's going to be the
Christ.
episode title, Airing It Out.
That's right. Um, the one in verse 1 is a different word than son. It's actually the word that's kind of universally, everyone translates that as heir.
Mm-hmm.
And that happens again too, I think, in verse 7. That's the one that's being used there. But in verse 4, adoption as heirs, it literally says sons. But it's really clear in this context that it's not only talking to men. Um, and the point of it being a son is that in the patriarchal society in which they lived, sons were the heirs, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's what's being leaned on. And you've got that context already by the fact that it's talking about heirs over and over again already.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, like, you don't adopt someone as your heir, you adopt them as your son, and that makes them your heir. It's just literally how the system works. But the point is that they're your heir. And I think just translating it as heir clarifies that, gets rid of like the confusion that there could be about men and women being included equally, which they absolutely are. There's no distinction. Like, it makes that very clear in the last chapter, verse 28 there. So yeah, male and female, chapter verse 29. So if you are part of Christ, then you are Abraham's seed, heirs based on a promise. So it has already identified the females as the heirs. So let's
Yeah.
just leave it there as heirs in 5 so that there's no confusion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It gives it a little bit better flow, as well as not allowing us to particularly have sustained monogendering of the
Mm-hmm.
people of God.
Yeah. And so
Like
I've kind
it's,
of done that throughout, of when
mm,
there's sons and the point of the word son is heir, I just translate it as heir.
mm-hmm.
Um, Sometimes it's talking specifically about a son that's a man or a boy. And then I
Mm-hmm.
translate it as son because that's the context. But
Yep.
yeah.
So, out of curiosity, does it change? Would it have changed? I'm looking at verse 6. So, because you were
Mm-hmm.
heirs, God sent his son's life breath into our hearts that were, so we're calling out Abba, Father. Why not change the word son there to heir? Is there a
This
rhetorical
the one here, God
meter?
sent his son.
Yeah. I mean, I know because Jesus is what the incarnation was presumably male.
Oh,
Um,
yeah. It could go either way there, as long as it's clear that we're talking about Jesus. I think it would be fine.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I can see how reading it all consistently, son, there's sort of this like, there's a nesting kind of argument of like,
Mm-hmm.
you're all sons. He's the son. You are folded into the sonship of God, of Jesus
Right.
with the Father. But the heir, like, because you are heirs, God sent his
Yeah.
heir.
No, I like that, keeping the consistency to like to show the equation that's happening there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, maybe even something like God sent his capital H heirs life
Yeah,
breath
there you go.
into our hearts. That could be a good way to work that out.
That could be a new Trinitarian formula: the source, the air, and the life breath. Although air and breath would make people or and the orality of that would be
Right. Yeah. If it's in
baffling,
being spoken rather than read. Yeah.
but also quite fitting with remaining grafted to Judaism and all of their affinity for
True.
wordplay and puns.
True. Yep. You've got the air in the air. Yeah.
Yeah. And the
Yeah.
guy who's the one who's in the air.
That's right.
Yeah. The sky, as you translated, excuse me. Uh,
I go back and forth. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, I love keeping it more human
Mm-hmm.
in this translation, and room for all humans who are not male identifying. Last one is this big. Oh no. Let's do gratification and then the big weird.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. The gratification could be a little quicker.
That's what she said.
So, all right. I beg you, Brandon, stop. Okay. Yeah. No, this section, this paragraph here. So I beg you, my family, to come like me, since I also am like you. You have not acted unjustly toward me, but as you know, originally, I announced the triumphant message to you because of a bodily weakness, a test for you in my body. But you did not treat me with contempt or reject me. Instead, you welcomed me with respect, like a messenger of God, like Christ Jesus. So, where is your sense of gratification? Because I attest to you, if possible, you would have plucked out your eyes and given them to me. Have I then become a hateful person toward you because I speak truth to you?
Hmm.
Yeah, part of the word gratification there is traditionally blessing.
Mm-hmm.
but it's different than the one in chapter 3 where you like speak a blessing, speak well over someone. um it's this is like more like the beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, gratified are the poor in spirit. The sense of being aware of receiving something good that inspires gratitude.
Yeah.
um and here it kind of gets to be weird. Like if this is just like, where's your sense of blessing, kind of, what does that mean? We tend to assume that that's like God did something good for you, you were blessed. But it's actually talking about, you did something good for me, you treated me well.
Mm-hmm.
And where is the sense of like that reciprocal gratitude that we've built with each other? Because now I'm telling you the truth and you're acting like I'm being hateful toward you. I'm absolutely not. I'm grateful for you, and for like I'm trying to help you here. Why aren't you responding with gratitude to me like I have gratitude for you? um,
Mm-hmm.
so it's not a huge shift. I think for me it helps it feel clearer. um,
Mm-hmm.
I know the word gratification is not one that everybody uses like all the time, and so maybe it doesn't help it feel clearer for everyone else.
Yeah.
um, but at least it's not the like glazed over, I hear the word blessing and I just think I know what that means and I'm moving on. At least
Boy,
gives you a chance to stop and think about what's going on here.
that's good. Yeah, just get all. It's part of that commitment to not settle for religious technical language or, yeah, just religious conventional language, um,
Yeah.
and make it help us actually engage more closely. Like a little bit of traction on the road goes a long way.
Right. Yeah. When
And the
words
next,
become a sound, it's no longer helpful.
that's right, Lasso's rule. Um, so the next stretch has too much traction on the road. I don't know what the hell is going on, and except that it's weird and uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I get a little queasy and blackout. So, how did you experience this?
It was uncomfortable to translate. It was one of those where like, I wish I could make some changes here.
Yeah, for context of those who didn't actually read it, we're talking about this stretch where he's like making this big parallel argument between Sarah and Hagar and Sinai and Jerusalem and the Torah and the Messiah. It's interesting but strange.
Mm-hmm.
What makes you queasy?
um Kind of, well, one, it's talking about an enslaved girl as if it's just normal to have people be enslaved,
Mm-hmm.
and that's queasy making enough. um but then like kind of even worse, it it's equating the church with the enslaver as preferable to the enslaved, um
Yeah.
in a really positive way. So like Wilda Gaffney, that we've referenced several times because I am just in love with her work, and I'm reading her book Womanist Midrash, and she talks about Sarah and Hagar, and the text really prefers Hagar in a lot of ways. Um, Hagar, for instance, is the only woman in the entire Bible that gives God a name. Um, that's quite an honor. El Roy, the God who sees me.
Wow.
Um, Whereas Sarah in that story is the one who has a slave girl, has enslaved a child, and offers her property, that girl, to Abraham to rape as many times as he need to get her pregnant, and then forces her to carry a baby to term to produce an heir.
Yeesh.
So yeah, forced pregnancy,
Yeah, and
childbearing,
in the context
rape,
of like
Yeah.
Yahweh tells Abram, like, hey, I'm gonna like bless everybody through you, ultimately through your heirs. And they're like, lol, we're old as shit. And and then like instead of trusting that there will be some way through, Sarah's Sarah's impulse is to be like, why don't you just keep raping her?
Hmm.
Which is like,
Yeah.
holy shit, Sarah Sarai, that's
Yeah. And,
not how this is supposed to work.
she is also marginalized, right? She's a woman
Yeah.
in a patriarchal society. Abraham twice told half truths and said that she was his sister, which she is his half sister, but failed to mention that she was also his wife and let other people marry her because he was afraid of them.
Yeah, so he's kind of
Like,
pimping her out.
right. So she gets to just be like passed around to whoever is most convenient for her husband here. Um, and so, yeah, she's marginalized, she's oppressed too.
Yeah.
And kind of going back to those fundamental assumptions, the way not to have a boot on your neck is to wear the boot, right? So she's just passing that along to Hagar. It's all part of this really messed up
Yep.
world system.
Patriarchy gets instilled in all of us. It's not just something that infects
Mm-hmm.
men. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So it's a complicated story
Yeah,
that Paul is appealing to.
it is. And he doesn't critique it, which is what makes it really uncomfortable. He just tells it and starts to make connections, really not even with the women, it's with their children. Um, so the one born from the enslaved girl, which isn't get a name here, she does a few verses later, but is not preferred apparently, versus the child born of the free woman
Mm-hmm.
is the preferred one. Um, which there's lots of really good theology in that and teaching, but just the context makes it really hard to even pay attention to that.
Mm-hmm. Like using a system, a story about oppression to make a side point that he's already done a great job arguing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, it may not be the time to make that.
Right, right.
Is there
So,
anything else you want to say, Paul?
right.
Keep going.
Uh, so his point ended up being like, you family are children like Isaac, the ones that result from God's promise.
Yeah.
Yay! You could
Yeah.
have just said that, like, seriously, but okay. uh, yeah, just as the one conceived based on bodily impulses targeted the one conceived based on the life breath, now it is also the same. Really, like,
Mm-hmm.
are we saying Ishmael is the bad guy here? Like, no, like, come on. God gave a promise to Ishmael too. Um, so the point here too, like being reading all this, it's really easy to, like, if you don't know the context, to like assume that God said to banish the enslaved girl and her son there in verse 30. God did not say that. That is quoting Sarah, not God, the enslaver.
Oh my goodness gracious.
So yeah, but what does the scripture say? Well, the scripture that's quoting Sarah says, banish the enslaved girl and her son, since the enslaved girl's son will not inherit along with, and then there's the end of the quote. In the what it's quoting, it can just say my son,
Mm-hmm.
but then it stops and says the free woman's son.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
therefore, family, we are not children of the enslaved girl, but rather of the free woman. Point all being, it's a promise. We're moving towards freedom, not continuing under enslavement to these world systems. It sure used a weird story to talk about getting out from under the world system, since it's so full of like the quote hero of the story not only participating in but kind of like really acting on behalf of that world system. But
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, it's pretty
Wow.
clear in Genesis that God's not thrilled with all the stuff that's happening there.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't address that at all here. So I guess that's where knowing your scriptures helps.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Which he's assuming that these are all very Jewish Christians who know Torah very well. I've memorized large portions of it, if not all of it. So
yeah, Greeks don't generally memorize this story. Well, on that note. Yeah, we've interrogated some fundamental assumptions. Thanks everybody for joining us again for this leg of the journey. The easiest way to support Found in Translation is to leave us a rating or a review on your podcast player of choice, especially Apple Podcasts. That just trickles down to everything. It helps a lot and makes it easier for more people to find the show and know that people are finding value here. Second best way to support the show is to become a sponsor. You can do that for just $5 a month. When you do that, you get comment access on the Translations Google Doc and the satisfaction that knowing that you're supporting exceptionally nerdy independent media. You can find the link to join that community in the show notes. The music you're listening to is by Kevin MacLeod at incompetech.com. Found in Translation was produced by Perry FM on unceded Chinook land. Goodbye, Brandon.
Bye, Brandon.
Bye, everybody.